Today we have a very special guest. We have Rolf Witzsche with us today on the Grand Solar Minimum channel. Rolf has a channel on YouTube as well, many other social media sites, but we found Rolf on YouTube. He does a lot of work with Ice Age and solar minimums and plasma and primer fields. Rolf, thanks for joining us today. How you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. We've been really looking forward to have this talk. Like I said, your productions, to me, some of the information that you deliver through your videos might not be so easy for people to take in. But one of my favorite things about you and your video productions, especially the Ice Age one, the dust one, at the end of the presentation that you were giving everyone, there's music, a beautiful music. And I'm a fan of some of the older classical stuff myself. So the one thing I love about your videos is that it's like the music is there for people to reflect on what they just heard. Like the music is background to digest, it's calming, it's soothing, because some of this information isn't really what a lot of people want to hear. And my first question is, what drew your attention to speak on global cooling?
You might not believe it, but it started with my writing. I wrote a novel on how to deal with the nuclear war issue, and I wasn't really too happy with it. I focused on the principle of universal love. So I thought to myself, you have to do better. Just focus directly on working together on the principle of universal love. And I wrote a novel, and it wasn't quite big enough, so I wrote a second novel to add on to it. And when the second novel was finished, the computer crashed.
Oh, no.
And so I lost about 2 months. I wasn't very good in making backups at those days. And so I said to myself, well, I mean, it crashed almost within the hour of me trying to send it. Oh, no. So and I said, what's missing? What's wrong? It's like a school teacher looked at my work and said, oh, well, that's nice, but you can do better, and ripped it up. So I said, what's missing? And it's almost like it was spoken. The idea came, the Ice Age is missing. And I said to myself, the Ice Age, we're talking about global warming.
Right.
So I put it aside, but it kept coming, and then people brought me back to it. And so reluctantly, I looked into it, and I did some studying on it. And a lot of things all of a sudden came together and make sense. And it was really quite scary what was coming together. But then it also dawned on me that we do have the opportunity to deal with all these problems. And actually, that in dealing with all these problems, we raise ourselves up above the quagmire that we are dealing with today on the political scene. And as we raise up ourselves to deal with the much larger issue, the little issues like nuclear war will be eventually resolved. So I see the Ice Age question as a challenge to humanity to get with it. And once we do that, the little things fall away. We've been dealing with nuclear war for 70 years, and we haven't come any closer to the solution. Instead, it's gotten worse. But the Ice Age, that really is an existential challenge. And when we had an existential challenge like during World War II, the United States mobilized itself. It created a whole new economy out of it. So if you have a real big challenge, then you mobilize yourself towards it. And so I see the Ice Age challenge in that respect, because unless you see it in a larger picture, you become demoralized. because the challenge is so big. We are literally facing, in 30 years, the Earth becoming uninhabitable. That's big. Canada will cease to exist, Russia, Europe, they become uninhabitable, and the areas within the tropics where the cold doesn't affect too much, there won't be enough water to maintain agriculture. All this needs to be done artificially. But we do have the means. We can produce fresh water in very large quantities, and we have the technological capability to deal with all that. So the Ice Age is no longer scary. It's just a challenge. But you need to understand that we do have this big challenge. That's what I'm trying to get across.
Now, Rolf, thank you for coming on to GSM. On our channel, we try to break down the science coming from all different angles. There's so much research out there basically showing that we are cooling and we're going into a cooling trend. How did you formulate your time frame using the primer field data?
The 30-year projection is built on the discovery, rather the measurements made by the Ulysses spacecraft, NASA's and ESO's spacecraft circled the sun for about 16 years, and they saw the solar wind pressure diminishing by 30% over the space of 10 years. That's huge in terms of cosmic timescales. I looked back and then I came upon these carbon-14 measurements, which showed that the minimum, the solar minimum, there was 3 big solar minima over the last 700-800 years, and each one was getting a little colder than the previous one, and the coldest was the Maunder minimum. We nearly lost it there because the level that had dropped down to such a low level that there were no sunspots at all. The sun had virtually ceased to have signs of life there for about 30 years. And then all of a sudden the sunspots came back. So I tried to figure out how comes that we got the sunspots back, that the sun got really invigorated. And it became obvious that the end of the Little Ice Age coincided with the 3 big warming spikes we had since about for the last 3,000 years, sort of in roughly 1,000-year intervals. There were great big warming spikes, the Mayonan warming, then we had the Roman warming, and then we had the medieval warming period, and the next one would be that spike that brought us out of the Little Ice Age, and that's the so-called modern global warming. But global warming wasn't done by humanity, that was done by the upramping of the sun. Since this was evidently over in the 1960s, the 1970s, if you can look at the sunspot cycles, the 1960 was the biggest one, and then 1970 was only about half that. It was really low, and then it recovered a little bit, and from then on it was sliding down towards what we have today, which is still sliding down some more. So I added this fact together, that we have the evidence in the sunspot cycles that the sun is getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and we have the evidence in the solar wind pressure that is getting weaker and weaker and weaker. So I've taken the the regression of the solar wind pressure and projected it forward in a linear manner to see where the solar wind pressure would be zero. If you project it forward, the solar wind pressure will be zero in the 2030s. There is no indication that the weakening of the solar system will stop then and will reverse, because that pulse that brought us out of the little ice age, the next one won't be for another 500 years or more, far too far away for us to affect it. So the solar system will continue to weaken, and eventually the sun itself will become cooler. Until now, the sun has remained steady in solar output. Only the solar wind has been weakening. The output, the temperature of the sun has remained steady within 1 or 2 degrees. It's very, very steady. But once the solar wind comes down to zero, which is sort of like an overpressure valve that vents off steam. When that no longer happens, the sun will diminish. And eventually you come to a point that the mechanism that focuses plasma onto the sun will collapse, because it's a magnetic structure that depends on the flow rate of the plasma coming in. And if the flow rate diminishes, that thing falls apart. That has been demonstrated in laboratory experiments. So I projected it forward, and I figured, well, about 20 years after the solar wind stopped, most likely the primal fields collapse. And then once this happens, the sun reverts back to a much lower level, and it won't just diminish slowly, it will just collapse back to a lower level, and that will usher in the ice age.
Today we have a very special guest. We have Rolf Witzsche with us today on the Grand Solar Minimum channel. Rolf has a channel on YouTube as well, many other social media sites, but we found Rolf on YouTube. He does a lot of work with ice age and solar minimums and plasma and primer fields. Rolf, thanks for joining us today. How you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. We've been really looking forward to have this talk. There's music. A beautiful music, and I'm a fan of some of the older classical stuff myself. So the one thing I love about your videos is that it's like the music is there for people to reflect on what they just heard. Like the music is background to digest, it's calming, it's soothing, because some of this information isn't really what a lot of people want to hear. And my first question is, what drew your attention to speak on global cooling?
You might not believe it, but it started with my writing. I wrote a novel on how to deal with the nuclear war issue.
Or, like I said, your productions, to me, some of the information that you deliver through your videos might not be so easy for people to take in. But one of my favorite things about you and your video productions, especially the Ice Age one, the dust one, at the end of the presentation that you were giving everyone,